So let's just start by making sure we're all on the same page here. Can you give us the 1 minute version of what climate change is and why it's happening?
Sure. The key to climate change is that people's activities are fundamentally changing the composition of the atmosphere and the impact of that atmospheric concentrations on temperature. And in effect, it's warming the Earth. This is the result of greenhouse gas concentration. So carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere as a result of burning fossil fuels, burning coal, burning oil, and putting that up in the atmosphere. And the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are higher than they've been in 3 million years. And that's before humans existed. So now this is affecting everyone on Earth. And you're living in an Earth that's been transformed by human actions. And the Earth is warmer than it ever has been in our own lifetimes.
So what is the amount of warming that we've experienced so far versus like the pre-industrial, what it's been?
Right. So I looked up 2020 is, as far as we know so far, the a tie for the warmest year on record. And so if you go to a global average, it's about 1.25 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial period. It's about 2.25 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you think about that relative to a recent average, say 1981 to 2010, that's about a degree Fahrenheit over that average. So keep in mind that that's globally averaged over the whole Earth. And one of the really sort of key things about climate change is that most of those hottest years on record are in the lifetimes of everyone in this room.
So I get that it's hotter, right? You were saying 1.25 degrees Celsius. What was the 1 degree Fahrenheit figure? What time frame was that for?
That was relative to the 1981 to 2010 average.
Okay.
So we're talking about a little over 2 degrees Fahrenheit over pre-industrial levels. Between pre-industrial to that 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you got 1 degree, and then you've got another 1 degree on top of that.
Okay. So pre-industrial, that's what I'm talking about, like the 1800s here?
Yeah, before 1850, before the Industrial Revolution.
So that, I mean, we're talking about 1-2 degrees? That sounds like a small number, is it?
Well, I mean, 1 degree is a degree. Everyone knows what a degree difference feels like. But the important thing is that's not uniform across the world. So that 1 degree is sort of every point on the globe. And one of the things about climate change and global warming is that warming is more at the higher latitudes, so more at the poles than at the equator. So that 1 degree averaged over the whole globe means a lot more in, for example, the Arctic, where it's impacting sea ice, for example, and ice sheet melting.
Okay, so it's affecting some areas more than others.
Right. The other part of that is that you're never experiencing an average temperature, right? There are high temperatures, there are low temperatures. And when you move that whole distribution of temperatures, those extremes go up as well. So you have more of those extreme temperatures. And when that whole average shifts. So that's an average that reflects, the whole population. But you can expect more extremes, and we're seeing that.
So that's interesting too, right? Because we're seeing more extreme weather now. And there was a time where people were saying we couldn't really attribute to climate change. And some people were saying we could attribute to climate change. So the hurricanes the more intense hurricanes we're seeing now, the heat waves, the wildfires, can we definitively say that those are caused by human caused climate change?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it used to be that scientists would say, well, there's no way you can attribute one single event to climate is the long-term average. That's one of the things that's really changed in research in the last decade. And we have really new methods that can tell us with what probability an event would occur and what's the chances of that event under climate change versus not under climate change. And you get some events, like, for example, some heat waves that, the probability it wouldn't occur under climate change is more than 90%. Like, it really wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for climate change. So you can begin to get at that kind of attribution and say, these heat waves, yeah, they wouldn't have happened without climate change. You raise the risk of that happening so much that you really wouldn't expect this particular heat wave to happen. With respect to, you talk specifically about wildfires and hurricanes. We know that climate change makes hurricanes stronger and more destructive because of warmer ocean temperatures. There's still a little bit of uncertainty on the number of hurricanes, but we know that there's more bigger hurricanes under climate change. With wildfires, there's also a clear link from drought and temperature. Of course, like everything, there's lots of things that affect wildfires, including intentional activities and fire suppression, but there's a very clear link to climate change.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So even though there are these other factors that are at play, still, what we're experiencing in the real world is, what we've seen in climate models that have tried to map out what it would look like, what these kinds of events would look like if climate change were happening, and it's kind of getting similar there.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So
yeah, I think
no, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is important to stress is that, a lot of these phenomena are complex, right? We understand that things have a lot of drivers, but climate change really comes in as the big player, right? So that climate change is just driving the major direction. And yes, there are certainly other influences, but climate change is determining and will continue to determine the trends in these for decades to come.
So we're covering a lot of this kind of stuff pretty quickly, but I welcome everybody to, if they have more questions about this, to submit them in the chat, and we can absolutely go over them in more detail in the Q&A. So Noelle, let's talk about what's in store for the future. So what kind of trajectory are we on right now?
So we're in 2020, 1.25 degrees above the pre-industrial period. Usually we quote this as a sort of longer term average. You think about what the longer term average will be sort of by the end of this century. We're heading for a temperature rise in excess of 3 degrees. That's more than double what we have now. And that's based on some of the projections from what emissions are going to look like. And those projections differ depending on how optimistic or pessimistic you think the pledges of different countries are. But there's no one that thinks that this that the current pledges and current policies are going to keep us below 2 degrees, for example.
Okay, so when you're saying pledges, you're talking about like the Paris Agreement, the commitments that these different countries have made to keep emissions down?
Right, exactly. So, as you're trying to project what greenhouse gas emissions are in the future, you're going to look at what countries and states and cities have said about what their emissions are. And even if you assume that everyone fulfills all of those goals, like we're going to cut by 50% by this date, you say, no problem, we're going to do that. You're still getting above 3 degrees.
So even if every country were to do what they said they were going to do, we still got a problem. We're still at 3 degrees. So what do we know, and maybe also what do we don't know about what 3 degrees means for our planet and for our society?
Well, that's a really massively disruptive level of climate change. And I think one of the things that's become clear, I think even in the last sort of 5 years or so, is how disruptive climate change can be on sort of a broad variety of different sectors. So you're talking about heat waves. You're talking about heat waves in places and at above 3 degrees, places in the world where it's really dangerous to work outside for any length of time. And the frequency of that really increases the higher you get. And at 3 degrees, it starts to be substantial. You're talking about deadly heat waves, for example, like happen in India and Pakistan, being annual events as opposed to decadal events. Extreme events like droughts and floods will become the norm as opposed to sort of just occasional events. You'll see impacts on agriculture, crops, coral reefs, and sensitive species as well as sea level rise is a pretty big one as well.
Okay. And again, we can go, if anyone has additional questions about those impacts, we can go into them a little more in the Q&A. So you were talking a little bit about the global climate goals. So what exactly are those? And, there are some numbers that are being thrown around like 1.5 and 2 degrees. And sometimes we hear 2030 and sometimes we hear 2050. What's up with all that?
So several years ago, in the context of global negotiations to address climate change, which have been going on for the last 30 years, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the global treaty that addresses climate change, was from 1992. So these negotiations have been happening for a while, and in the mid to late 2000s, countries came together and said, well, we'd like to avoid dangerous anthropogenic influence on the global climate, which is what was written in the original treaty. Okay, what humans are doing shouldn't be dangerous influence on the global climate, and actually said, well, let's define that, and came to a collective decision that limiting that warming to a global average of 2 degrees Celsius would be a threshold that people could agree to. And since then, there are some countries that have argued that 1.5 is actually a level that would prevent a lot more damage. So in the Paris Agreement, which was in 2015, that goal of having 2 degrees and, if possible, striving for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is sort of a global goal. And that's the aim of keeping warming to that level. That's still a pretty dangerous level of warming in terms of, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change now. But 1.5 and 2 degrees is about at the point where it starts to get from bad to worse. And so the argument for keeping to the lowest level possible is a really strong one.
Do we need to know what all these numbers really mean? Like 1.5, 2, or, we're kind of on the trajectory of 3. Like, what do we really need to, what's kind of like the person who's not a scientist, what do we actually need to understand here?
So the number actually you should keep in mind is 0. And that is because if you continue to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the concentration keeps going up and it keeps warming. So in order to meet any of these targets, we need to get to 0 emissions. And you'll hear the concept net zero. That means that there are processes that take CO2 out of the atmosphere, so you have to keep that in balance. But 0 is the number that you really need to keep in mind, because it's not just about sort of cutting emissions to a certain level. It's about getting rid of them completely in order to get any of these targets. And the degree of where you meet the target, it's really a timing problem, how quickly you can get to 0.
So what's the consensus or, among the community about what point we need to get to 0?
So if you want to get to a 2 degree target, that year globally is about 2070. There's a little bit of scientific uncertainty about exactly how you calculate it, but think ballpark 2070. At 1.5, 2050, that's 30 years away. And that's everyone, right? So that's all countries in the world. That's the entire world.
I mean, we're talking cars, we're talking coal plants, we're talking making cement, we're talking about ships going across the ocean, we're talking about everything.
Right, exactly. And so not just, I think a lot of people really focus on the energy sector alone, but we're also talking about food production, which is a huge part of the greenhouse gas emissions, transportation, plastics is a big one. They come from fossil fuels. So thinking about all sectors of the economy that have associated fossil fuel components, 30 years.
So what will it take to actually hit net zero by, let's say, 2050? And why is this such a challenging, difficult problem?
Well, there are a couple of things to think about. One of which is the trajectory that we're on, right? We're still in the going up as opposed to going down globally. So that's the challenge, right? Bending that curve, getting it going in terms of the trajectory it needs to get to zero. The longer you wait, the steeper that decline has to be. So that's a big challenge. The sort of practical challenge is a lot different in different places. I think there are cities and countries in Europe, cities and states in the US where, they've grappled with this challenge and are really trying to figure out in practice what would need to be done and what kind of incentives you need to have in the economy, what kind of supports, and really getting to that place. It's more difficult in places in the world where access to electricity is a key challenge as well at the same time.
Right, like they might not even have access to electricity, let alone clean electricity.
Right.
So we have a number of people who are from Massachusetts on the call. Can you tell us what's going on in Massachusetts right now as it relates to climate change?
Right. So Massachusetts just had a climate bill passed by the legislature. It mandates a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That 2030 is actually important because it sort of sets you on the right path. And it also does matter how sort of technically how many reductions come in the early part of those years. It has impacts on the climate system as well. So those two things have been passed by the legislature. It's sitting on the governor's desk. And I was just checking in on the news right before. No sign of what the governor is going to do, and we're running out of time in the legislative session. So if he vetoes it, there's not quite enough time for the legislator to come back, and they're trying to figure out what to do about that. So it's very much a big issue right now in Massachusetts of really getting those climate goals into law so that, energy companies and you can set the right incentives and start doing the work of actually getting the greenhouse gas emissions out of the major sectors of the economy.
Yeah, so if you're from Massachusetts, you're going to want to check that out now, tonight, and perhaps contact the governor if that's something.
Call the governor tomorrow. Yeah.
Is there any other state in the United States that it has a plan on the table like that, or has already passed one?
There are several states. California has some ambitious plans. Maine, I think, has some plans in New England. I don't have the list in front of me, but there are several U.S. states and also cities that have pretty ambitious climate goals. And there's a growing number of countries as well that have net zero goals.
And so, I'm sorry, I said, and companies as well?
And companies as well, yeah.
Including some, majorly polluting companies, right? Like some oil companies even that have goals like this.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of those things that I think as companies start to think about it, if you're looking at your long-term future, and particularly with companies where, your product is something and you're not in the energy industry, you are thinking about long-term future. You're going to have to figure out ways to produce your products without fossil fuels if you're going to envision that long-term future. And, for example, for biotech companies, that's what do we do about plastics? Things like that, for food companies, how do you think about meat production when that has a very high greenhouse gas footprint?
So speaking of regulation and these big changes that are coming, President-elect Biden has made climate change one of the 4 priorities of his presidency. So what can we expect him to do or try to do?
Well, yeah, as you said, it's going to be a very different federal landscape in the United States. And Biden's plan really does follow the science as I've outlined it. It focuses on net zero no later than 2050, which is really consistent with the kinds of Paris Agreement goals that we see. The additional part of the Biden plan that I think the administration will try to advance is really coupling that with a focus on environmental justice issues. So really looking at climate change in the context of making people's lives better. So it's not just sort of a sectoral thing that we have to address anymore. It really is integrated into economy, people's livelihoods, people's health. And addressing climate change is something that we have to do both in the near term and in the longer term to ensure that that's sort of sustained. So I think, you know, there are ways to get to net zero that benefit people more on the ground, and that emphasis is definitely there in the Biden plan to really look at sort of how to do this in a way that supports the poorest communities, for example, those most vulnerable to environmental hazards.
Right. And actually, that's part of some of the research that you do as well, is how are the actions that we can take now that, support a low carbon future and support us with climate change, at the same time, they solve some of the other problems that we're dealing with. So can you share a little bit about some of the short-term benefits and opportunities that we could see in our own life in our own lifetime in taking action on climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of my research really looks at what kind of decisions that regulators can make that benefit people really right away. And one in particular is air pollution. And it's really not quantified, and people are sort of used to the damages in air pollution. But particulates in the atmosphere lead to a lot of mortalities, both in the United States and worldwide. Cardiovascular impacts, asthma attacks. Air quality is a substantial problem in cities across the world. Moving away from fossil fuels will make a big impact on air quality. And that's something that people in cities, people who have asthma, for example, are going to see right away. And that kind of decision to think about coupling the climate action that you need to accomplish with stuff that you should be doing anyway to benefit people are trying to find those solutions. Again, multiple pathways to get fossil fuels out of the economy, and finding the ways that are most beneficial to people on the ground is some of the research that we're doing at MIT.
That's great. So I actually want to just wrap up the fireside chat portion of this so we can spend the next half an hour and then on Q&A, and as well as after the breakout sessions, more time on Q&A. But Professor Selin, before I do that, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I didn't finish sort of my my comment on President-elect Biden. As one of the things that's really important in this realm is sort of coupling these domestic actions with international action as well. And what we expect to see is President Biden rejoining the Paris Agreement and re-engaging in productive ways with the international community. And that has a couple of different implications. One of which is thinking about how the U.S. can really lead in this area. So in developing technology, in becoming at the forefront, because again, if we're going towards a fossil-free future, then the U.S. wasted 4 years. It's behind a bit on technologies, on sort of that implementation relative to countries who have been trying to do this. So that's going to be really, really important in terms of global leadership. The other is sort of reestablishing the US as a sort of force in the negotiations for things like transparency, for good data on the climate problem. And that's always been something that the US engagement has been really, really good about, is to say, NASA has great data, for example, on carbon dioxide, making sure that that data is shareable, that emissions are what we think they are, and you can track that as that goes down. Those kinds of things, the U.S. leadership is really, really important for.
Thank you so much for that. And I know we have a lot more to talk about there. Anna, I'm going to pass it over to you. I know we have an active chat going on right now, as well as when people register, they also submitted questions. So please take us away.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to start with a question that came in the Eventbrite from someone who registered. You talked a little bit about some data from NASA. So one of the questions is, will space research aid in insight into climate change? And you already answered that a little bit, but do you think you could expand on it more?
Yeah, sure. I think the more data we have to really understand both climate change and its impacts, the better. So things that we can and monitor from space are concentrations of different gases in the atmosphere, things like sea level. These things are important for planning, and they're also important because space-based observations can really look at places where it's hard to set up field stations and where there's not been a lot of sort of scientific field work in the past. So for example, being able to sense atmospheric conditions in places like Africa, so particulate matter in Africa. There haven't been a lot of network stations like we have in the United States that are measuring air quality in real time in urban centers, and satellite observations can help fill that gap.
Right. So we have a question from Victoria. Victoria, I'm going to unmute you now. So there's a request to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I guess mine's just more of a simpler question. In general, what are some things that the US and all countries can do to at least get to that 1.5 number you were talking about previously?
So one of the important steps that we can do, that the technology exists right now, is think about electrifying everything, and think about converting some of the sort of fuel uses that are currently fossil fuels to electric, where the electricity can come from cleaner sources like solar and wind. And you're seeing this beginning, for example, with electric vehicles, for example. And to the extent that you can take an internal combustion engine and actually transfer that to electric where it's cleaner, you can see that potential for transitioning happening. So growing the fraction of renewables on the grid at the same time as putting more of those sources into electricity. So that's one of the major things that's possible to do right now.
I just want to build upon that really quickly because, we're all in a house, or apartment or something right now. I have my water furnace. I have my furnace, my heat. I have my gas cook stove. I have a plug-in hybrid car, but it still uses gas, right? So those are 4 areas where my machines that I own are burning fossil fuels, right? So it's like, it's real in all of our homes right now. The ways that our kind of our structure and the appliances and things that we use are contributing directly to this issue. And so you're talking about like those kinds of things that we're talking about, converting over to electricity so we can get that from wind and solar and other kinds of clean energy sources.
Right. And this is where it really starts, where you can kind of visualize the 30-year time frame really being impactful and sort of think about it in your own life. So you think about sort of in the US, buying a house, a 30-year mortgage is pretty standard, right? Think about how old your furnace is in your house, right? Maybe 20, maybe 25. I've seen some that are a little bit older than that. As those come to the end of life, you're going to be thinking about replacing that with electric. That transition is happening. So, think about, potentially, so the part of the new climate plan in Massachusetts is, 2035, all vehicles will be electric, all vehicles sold in the Commonwealth. And that's a pretty common date. It seems ambitious at this point. That's 15 years from now. That probably means, that if you buy a car today and keep it for 10 years, the majority of cars that you're going to be buying in 2030 are going to be electric, because it's going to be zero in 2035 in terms of the internal combustion engine. So think about, your next car or your car after that, depending on how long you keep it, probably going to be all electric. 2035, 15 years from now. Anyone have a 15-year-old car in the Yeah. So think about that as a time frame, right? And then think about the kinds of systems that have to change. And this is where things like the state policies are really important, to give people sort of, those free loans that tell you, we're gonna give you a 0% interest loan to pay for your next heater. We're gonna give you a subsidy. We're gonna give you a tax credit to make sure that people can afford to make those changes, make sure that those changes can be made in rental housing and big units. And that's where sort of the government influence is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say here in Pennsylvania, we have a tax credit to convert away from electric heaters to natural gas heaters, but not the other way. So thinking about the kinds of policies that are in place. All right, let me turn it back over to Anna for some more questions.
Great. All right, Patty Muldoon, you are next, and I'll ask you to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
I appreciate this very brief presentation very much. And you talked mostly about CO2, and I'm interested in methane. And I can say in my neighborhood and in Arlington, we've got a lot of natural, I hate that term, natural gas leaks. And all that methane is going up into the air, and it's not counted in your numbers that you presented. And I wondered if you could do that.
Right. So yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's not only a greenhouse gas. It's a greenhouse gas is particularly potent in looking at near-term warming. It's also contributes to air pollution like smog, sort of on a regional to global level. So methane's a big problem to the extent that you can plug those leaks in the near term. We're certainly doing a lot towards the problem, but on the other hand, we're also the number to keep in mind is 0. So again, thinking about that natural gas infrastructure, and I agree with you, natural sounds a little too natural for that. You're going to be thinking about how you can not use those pipelines in the future, not plugging leaks, but not having anything flowing through them. And trying to make that transition. And that's because of the length of time of this infrastructure. That's why we really have to be starting today at, setting standards for when you're building something new. Make sure you build it with the most advanced technologies, because, anyone who has done any work on a home knows retrofitting is always more expensive and more difficult. And, you have to rip out stuff that you shouldn't have done in the first place. So, setting those incentives now so that 15 years from now, you're not rebuilding something that ought to have been new.
I'm sorry, I may not have been clear enough, because I certainly agree with everything you said, but in your numbers, when you're talking about global warming and, 3 degrees rise based on CO2, can you include the methane effects?
If we knew exactly what it was, we wouldn't have such a problem quantifying it, right? So certainly we can, and there's some estimates that it makes a difference. But the question of leaks, if you're thinking about it depends on the time scale you're thinking about, right? So certainly methane emissions are bigger than we think they are. You can adjust those estimates either way, but ballpark, they're consistent numbers. And again, one of the ways that methane comes in is depending on how you treat methane and other greenhouse gases, those sort of 2050 numbers go up or back 2 or 3, 4 years. But ballpark, they're in the same range.
So we don't have to change anything on the CO2 numbers because we also have massive methane emissions.
I mean, we don't have to, we have to be a little bit more aggressive, depending on what you assume with methane leaks. But I mean, again, if you tell me I have to go for 2048 or 2052, that's the kind of, I would say that's probably the kind of uncertainty. And then depending on how you think about all greenhouse gases and when they're phased out, there's some uncertainty in that number to begin with. So it doesn't change the basic message, it changes the details, I would say.
So Patty, we're just going to move on because I want to make sure we get to some other questions, but we will have some time at the end, and Professor Selin has offered to stay on. So Anna, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah. Sorry, folks, my internet went out for a bit, but I'm back now. So I'm going to put it over to Kelly. So Kelly, go ahead, ask your question.
Sure. Yeah. I'm curious, as a single person in Newton, Massachusetts. I've heard of people trying to track their carbon footprint. How does one do that? I'm single, just renting. So I appreciate your, examples of thinking about, I might be buying a car in the next year or so. So, I might actually consider a hybrid. I would love to have an electric, but I don't feel like the infrastructure is out there enough yet. So kind of twofold there. So how do I otherwise, track my carbon footprint or figure that out?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of sites online, and I can follow up with some links afterwards. But you can go sort of personal carbon footprint, and you can enter things like your electricity use, if you know from your electric bill, or you can estimate it by square footage, the type of house you live in. That's sort of one structural thing. You enter your zip code, and they'll calculate sort of where the general electricity mix in your region, how you heat your house, for example, heating and cooling. So that's a portion of that. Transport behavior is also another one. It'll ask you sort of, commuting, car use, airplane travel, which is a big one. And I'll get back to that in a second. And then the other is food. So food consumption is a fairly substantial chunk. How much meat you eat is a big lever there, because meat has a high carbon footprint, and also how many miles that food travels to get to you as a sort of lesser consideration. It's funny when you think about sort of the plug-in hybrid cars. I always did this, and even with a few flights a year, that was really the dominant part of my carbon footprint. And I do it every year in class. And, this year when I did my carbon footprint, I did my flights for 2020 and realized that 2020 during the pandemic, I actually bought a plug-in hybrid. And that 65 miles a gallon plug-in hybrid versus the flights were way, way more. So the pandemic has declined my carbon footprint quite a lot, even having bought a plug-in hybrid. Of course, not driving it by T. This is my commute, so.
All right. Thanks, Kelly, for your question. This is a question from YouTube. I'm going to read it straight off. So this person asks, what are your thoughts on carbon offsets? And do you think companies purchasing carbon offsets is sustainable? And you may have to help define carbon offsets for us.
Right. So carbon offsets basically says, I want to reduce my carbon footprint. Instead of reducing that, I'm going to pay for someone else to sort of either suck up the carbon, so plant a tree somewhere else type thing, or reduce CO2 elsewhere. So for example, if you go and you book a flight, sometimes there's a little window depending on which airline you are. So would you like to offset your carbon and pay this much extra? And there's a price associated with that. I can think of sort of two things about carbon offsets. One of which is, as an interim solution to help people think about what the burden of their sort of current burning of fossil fuels is. It's quite helpful to think about what the potential cost is, whether they're actually verifiable in terms of the actual implementation. I've seen research that does not convince me that they are actually seeing the reductions. So I've heard a lot of people say, well, in terms of that price, I would rather take that price and invest it in some other sort of activity that might be sort of compensating for the decline in well-being that I am imposing on the world because of the CO2 emissions in the world. Once you sort of go towards net zero, you realize that, you know, there's no real amount of trade-off that can let you keep burning something if that isn't in the budget. So there's only so much you can kind of borrow in that frame. So that's sort of my general sense of the carbon offsets. I don't really trust the CO2, and we're going to net zero, and 0, 0, not just net zero.
All right. Thanks for your question, whoever asked that on YouTube. Right now, we're going to go to Crystal Castro. I will ask you to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for letting me ask my question. So my question was just if you can speak a little bit about feedback loops. I feel like that has a big impact on climate change and its effects on us. And I was just hoping you could give a little rundown about what it is.
Sure. So there are a lot of feedbacks in the climate system. So think one of the really straightforward ones is, you know, if you think about melting ice. So one of the things that sort of, if you think about the balance of heat in the earth, is that white surfaces are cooler. You kind of know that from the summer. If you wear a white shirt versus a black shirt, the black shirt absorbs heat, you might be hotter. Sort of same applies to the earth. Essentially, the Arctic is wearing a white sheet, and when it melts, it's no longer wearing a white sheet. It's got a blue ocean on the top of it, and could then absorb more heat. So there are a bunch of these types of feedbacks in the climate system that can kind of accelerate warming, and sort of understanding the mechanisms for those and how the feedbacks interact is a lot of the kinds of science we do, because you're talking about a really complex system. There's also feedbacks among people as well. So sort of, you know, network effects of things that grow, and, you know, exponential growth is essentially a feedback. A lot of people understand exponential growth a little better after the pandemic, but you see these exponential growth dynamics in a lot of places in people's relationship with the environment as well. So yeah, it's a huge topic. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the dynamics of it. And you know, again, if you have specific areas that you're interested in, happy to follow up after.
Professor Selin, you gave some examples of what a feedback is, but could you define it for us? Like what does that mean, feedback?
So if you have, you know, A influencing B that then kind of comes back and influences A. So you kind of get this reinforcing behavior. So you can also have A, you know, A goes up, B goes up, that makes A go down. That sort of balances things out. So the feedback, the example I gave with the ice sheet, that would be, you know, A goes up, B goes up, A goes up, B goes up. You know, so it kind of feeds on itself.
It gets warmer, it melts more ice. Now you have darker surfaces, so it gets warmer, which melts even more ice. So that's the kind of piece there. So how worried are scientists about, so it sounds like there are feedback loops that just happen naturally anyway, right? They probably, you know, it's not, but then there's maybe, like I've heard the term runaway climate change, where I think that has to do with these feedback loops just kind of exacerbating. How worried are scientists about this kind of stuff?
So, I mean, scientists have been sort of worried about climate change for a really long time. And part of that worry is sort of uncertainty, in the sense that, you know, you're bringing the Earth into a place that has concentrations that we haven't seen in 3 million years. And we know that these kinds of feedbacks have happened in the past in the Earth. But what we're looking at right now are levels that, you know, we're not in this sort of runaway Venus greenhouse world, but a lot of feedbacks that can happen on a smaller scale are pretty nasty, and people are pretty worried about in the scientific community, because you see this in ecosystems, for example, like ecosystem collapse on a local scale. Those kind of feedback mechanisms, where you suddenly have, for example, something that, used to be able to support one kind of plant and now it just sort of tips over. That kind of dynamic occurs in nature. And if you start pushing different places, these are going to happen.
Anna, do we have more questions from the group?
All right. We do. So we have time for one more question from the audience, and we'll be going into our breakout rooms. But just to remind everyone, there is extra time for questions at the end. So definitely hold on to them. So next person up will be Nicholas. Nicholas, I'll ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi. So it's no secret. It's no secret that the era of bipartisanship, the kind that prevailed in the 90s under the Bush 41 and Clinton administrations, has been in serious decline for a while now. But with a new presidency on the horizon, at a time where we've reached record high deficits and debt totaling $3.2 trillion and $27.8 trillion respectively, do you think it's possible that a carbon tax could be pushed through on a federal level as the means of beginning to pay down our deficit, putting our country on a fiscally and environmentally sustainable path for future generations?
And Professor Selin, I'd like you, for people who are not familiar with a carbon price or a carbon tax, if you could define that.
Right. So the idea of putting a price on carbon, there's a couple of different mechanisms or ways to do that. But the idea really is to say, if you're emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, you really ought to be sort of paying for that privilege. And that's a way, if you actually cost that. Right now, it's essentially free. And the idea is to send a price signal to minimize that. I think it's really interesting to think about what will happen sort of at the federal level going forward. I'm not going to guess what kind of legislation is going to come out of a Congress with a razor thin Democratic majority and President Biden. I think it's going to be hard whatever they come up with, and taxes historically have been a really hard thing to get through Congress for both parties. I think what you'll see is a broad range of, if we succeed in seeing anything, a broad range of different solutions, not that really prioritize economic recovery, prioritize certain economic groups, and really start thinking about a combination of those big legislative instruments, but also a good amount of regulatory policy that can be accomplished with just executive action, and an increase in the pressure from the states and localities that have actually put in some of these policies themselves to sort of not be on their own. I think that's going to be important when you don't have a federal headwind for something like California's policies that have historically been leading and then adopted by other states. So I'm not going to predict what happens in Congress, but I'm interested to see. And I think, making sure that the message gets across that this is not something that's sort of a sectoral policy anymore, that climate policy really is everything policy, is a really important message for that. I think even scientists sort of hadn't really gotten until the past 5 years. I even have seen this year some discussions about, should we be talking about climate change or should we be talking about X number of other issues? And one of the things that I really want to underscore is climate change is all those other issues. If you care about all those other issues, you ought to be caring about climate change, because it's the means to everything else you're caring about in the sort of short, medium, and longer term.
All right. So we are at 8 o'clock now. So I will split everyone up into separate breakout rooms. It'll be random, and we'll have about let's see, 7 to 8 minutes to discuss some of these questions that Laura put into the chat. So one thing you learned, one question you still have, and did anything change for you in this discussion? Like we said at the beginning, if things come to a natural close, feel free to come back into the lobby area. There will be about 4 to 5, four participants per room. All right, so here we go. everyone as people are trickling back in. Just give it about 5 more seconds. All right. Laura, do you have any comments before we get back into the questions?
No, I'm just, how do people like the breakout sessions? Good? Okay? I always find them to be really, really thoughtful, and it's great getting to know a little bit more of the other people on the call. And some other questions came up, so let's get right to them.
Great. All right, I'm going to ask a question that was texted into us. So that question says, it's very broad. So it says, to what extent, if any, is global warming reversible?
That's a really good question. And actually it's not very reversible, pretty irreversible actually. So done some, so there's one of my colleagues, Susan Solomon at MIT, has done some work on sort of what potential reversibility there is. And the title of her paper was something like global warming is irreversible. But the idea is that, you know, you'll have a little bit if you stabilize greenhouse gases, but you know, it's a very long time scale that we're talking about on sort of human lifetimes. So whatever we emit in the next couple of decades, we're kind of stuck with for, you know, generations of people. So this is why it's so important, is because of the inertia in the climate system. You're talking a decadal and a century scale problem, you know, not one that we can shut off and it goes back to the pre-industrial.
All right. So we have a question from Yang next. Go ahead, Yang.
Hello, thank you very much for the event. I always enjoy the civic series. I'm one of the veterans. So my question, I guess, is somewhat related to the previous one. I wanted to know, like, what your thoughts on, are you hopeful of some of the wilder geoengineering ideas out there for either curbing climate change or even potentially reversing it? And the only example I can think of is, I think, like seeding the atmosphere with sulfur or something like that to either, I think, to reflect some of the heat energy from the sun coming into the earth. So I wonder, like, is that just crazy talk, or is there some possibility to that?
So yeah, I think
Professor Selin, if you wouldn't mind also just defining what geoengineering, that concept is.
right. So the topic of geoengineering is there some sort of engineering-based solution that can sort of act globally to modify the climate, to potentially counteract the effect of what people are emitting into the atmosphere. And there have been a variety of things that have been proposed, and sort of there are a couple of different categories. The idea of putting kind of scattering substances, sort of particles in the atmosphere at a high altitude is the one you referred to. Those are sort of in the idea of solar radiation management. So sort of shading how much the sun is actually doing. And I will talk about sort of sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere part slightly differently. With respect to the solar radiation management, you know, this is something scientists have looked into. I don't think that this is something that is a realistic idea for the future. It's dangerous, it has unintended impacts, and it also doesn't address a good chunk of the climate problem, which is what's happening in the oceans. So coral reefs, for example, the amount of carbon. It's basically sort of masking the problem. You'd have to do it continuously. You know, the possibility of impacts on crops and things like that there's a great potential for it. Again, thinking about what can be done on the actual emissions reduction side, and that technologies are there, sort of to me means that geoengineering of that sort really should be a non-starter. The sucking carbon, this idea of sort of negative emissions technology is the way to sort of sequester carbon. Those are a little bit of a different story because you kind of can actually get carbon out of the system. So, you're actually addressing the root of the problem. The problem with that is just, verifiability as well as scale. So a lot of the scenarios that people have run thinking about getting to a 1.5 degree target also involve really a lot of assumptions about the prospects for sucking carbon out of the atmosphere via a variety of technologies and immobilizing it. But, to me, it seems like that's best as a sort of stopgap kind of thing, or extra added bonus on the end, given the kinds of technologies that we have to actually fulfill people's needs without CO2 emissions.
I just want to add, I run an MIT podcast on climate change, and we did a 10-minute episode on geoengineering. So if you're interested, I just put the link in the chat here. It's basically a 10-minute answer to your question, as opposed to Noelle's very succinct 2-minute answer.
And you'll actually see a bunch of different opinions on geoengineering. So I don't know who from MIT you had on there, but you might get a quite different story if you listen to a bunch of different folks. So
yeah, it's not a different story. It's actually an alumni, Janusz Pastor, who runs he deals with a lot of the political, like international political implications of geoengineering. So it really builds upon what Professor Selin just said. Oh, I think Anna's screen might have frozen here. So I know one question that came up in our chat. Let me just see. Victoria, I don't know if you're still available, but I would invite you to ask your question.
Wang, unmute yourself. You should ask your question.
Okay, great. So Anna, we're having a little trouble hearing you because your internet's spotty. So Wang, if you're still there, she unmuted you, so you can ask your question.
Yeah, sure. So it's very glad to hear your speech. And then my question comes from the discussion about the electric car. So I guess I'm more care about like what choices can I make. I've kind of heard about the idea about the biofuel a few years ago. And then I'm just wondering, compared to an electric car, how does it work in terms of reducing the greenhouse gas emission? Kind of which one is kind of better? And is that biofuel a kind of intermediate step towards the reducing the emission?
So it really depends. I mean, thinking about the prospects for biofuel, it really depends sort of where you are, some of the technologies, whether sort of that liquid fuel and what the carbon footprint of that fuel is. So it's hard to tell without sort of thinking about, for example, some of the early ethanols in the United States, which were biofuels, were actually could be judged as worse than gasoline. I would say that really the way that both the market and the sort of incentives are going and efficiency, the electric cars really are kind of taking over at this point, and you're seeing that growth, and you're also seeing sort of mandates coming in as well as infrastructure. So one of the challenges with biofuel is that, what are you going to do to fuel it up, right? And in most countries in the United States, that's just not an option. You have maybe some blends, but increasingly you're seeing charging stations. And I think that rollout will continue, because that's sort of the decision that a lot of that governments have made in terms of facilitating a non-internal combustion engine, which is more efficient in terms of thinking about how to use that energy.
All right, I think we're going to close out with a question that came up a couple of times, and you've answered part of it, but I think kind of a concluding thought that often comes up is, or question that often comes up is what can an individual do? What's your recommendation for someone who says, I care about climate change, I want to do something about it that's actually going to make a difference? What's your answer to that?
So I think first of all is sort of structural action. Anything, thinking about policies, thinking about incentives, again, pushing elected representatives, voting, getting those policies in place is really step one. And that goes hand in hand with any individual actions you can do in your own life, because there's only so much you can do as an individual and only so much that can scale. And I think one of the things that we see, one of the examples of that is what we've seen during the pandemic, where a lot of people's lifestyles changed dramatically, and we didn't see greenhouse gas emissions go to zero, right? There was only so much that dropped when, you can't really think about how much more your travel plans could change, your transit, right? Thinking about that kind of lifestyle change and that magnitude, and then what it did with the CO2 emissions, 10% maybe for a little while. So you definitely need to work both on the individual level and yes, send those market signals. People, the more people who are interested and who come and ask about electric cars, the more, car makers will see that demand. And again, that's a feedback as well. But also pushing the elected representatives to put in those goals and supports.
Great. So scale is the name of the game.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're gonna close out here. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much, Professor Selin, for your wonderful and thoughtful and concise remarks, and for answering all of our questions. I really appreciate it. We have a survey that we're going to send to all of you. If you want to fill it out now, Anna will put the link in the chat. It's just civicseries.org/survey. We really want to hear from you, what you thought about this event, what your ideas are for future events, and get your feedback. Also, want to let you know that we're recording all of these sessions, taking about 30 minutes of highlights and putting them on our podcast. Dave Lashansky, who's on the call, and Anna Tran, they're our producer and production assistant. So they work on these episodes. So wherever you get your podcast, check out Civic Series. You can see a previous one that we just launched today on oil, which if you're really interested in what the future of oil is and opportunities for reducing that fossil fuel, check out that really great episode. So again, thank you so much, Professor Selin, for your time, and good night, everybody.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for asking great questions.
Take care. Professor Selin, if you wouldn't mind staying on for a moment while we wrap up.
Sure.